Sound of a roaring jet engine mixed with a gentle cinematic score. Narrator. VO. They saw a field. I saw a runway. They saw a rusty tractor. I saw a family's legacy. The homeowners association drew a line in my soil and called my land theirs. They gave me a violation, but I gave them a sonic boom. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a seed catalog and a bill for tractor parts. It was offensively cheerful, printed on thick, cream-colored cardstock, the kind of paper that suggested importance without earning it. At the top, a logo of 3 perfectly uniform, sterile-looking pine trees was embossed above the words, Evergreen Meadows Homeowners Association. Arthur Vance held it with grease-stained fingers, the paper a stark, unwelcome intruder, in the rustic quiet of his workshop. He was 62, a man carved from the same stubborn bedrock as the farm he stood on. His face was a road map of long days under a Kansas sun and the focused intensity of a life spent at 30,000 feet. His knuckles were permanently swollen, from years of wrestling with machinery, both on the ground and in the air. He slit the envelope open with a pocket knife that had belonged to his father, the bone handle worn smooth as a river stone. Dear Mr. Vance, this letter serves as a formal notification regarding the parcel of land adjacent to the Evergreen Meadows community, historically known as the North Hayfield of Vance Farms. Pursuant to a recent and thorough review of the original county, plat maps, and the founding covenants of the Evergreen Meadows development, Covenant 17, Section B, this 50-acre parcel has been officially designated as Community Property Green Space. Art read the sentence again. And a third time. The words swam, refusing to make sense. Community property. The phrase was alien, a parasite attaching itself to the living tissue of his heritage. The North Hayfield wasn't a parcel. It was where his grandfather had taught his father to drive this very tractor. It was where Art had watched meteor showers with his late wife Sarah, bundled in blankets in the bed of his Ford pickup. It was 50 acres of soil soaked in Vance sweat, Vance history. He walked out of the workshop, the letter trembling slightly in his hand. The setting sun cast long shadows from the ancient oak that dominated his yard. To the west, his land rolled. On, a patchwork of cultivated fields, a weathered red barn, and the modest farmhouse his great-grandfather had built with his own 2 hands. To the east, just beyond a line of newly planted, embarrassingly small decorative maples, lay Evergreen Meadows. It was a blight. A Stepford subdivision of identical beige houses with identical 2-car garages and identical manicured lawns, each blade of fescue cut to precisely 3 inches. It had sprung up over the last 2 years, a cancer on the edge of his property, replacing the open prairie with a sterile landscape of oppressive conformity. The sounds of his farm, the lowing of his few remaining cattle, the growl of the John Deere, were now often drowned out by the whine of lawn mowers and the incessant, cheerful chirping of brand-new sprinkler systems. He could see the North Hayfield from where he stood. It was a long, beautiful, uninterrupted stretch of flat, open land, currently fallow. To the HOA, it was a blank canvas for their vision of suburban utopia, a dog park, perhaps, a soccer field for their overscheduled children, a place for community picnics where they could complain about property taxes and the color of their neighbors' government-mandated recycling bins. To Art, it was something else entirely. It had always been something else. He crumpled the letter in his fist. The confrontation came 2 days later. A gleaming white Lexus SUV, so clean it looked like it had been birthed in a laboratory, pulled up to his fence line. 3 figures emerged. The one in the lead was a woman in her late 40s, dressed in crisp white linen pants and a salmon-colored blouse. Her blonde hair was shellacked into a perfect helmet, and her smile was a weapon of mass condescension. This had to be Brenda. He'd heard her name whispered with a mixture of fear and reverence by the cashier at the local hardware store. "Mr. Vance?" she called out, her voice carrying an infuriatingly pleasant tone that set Art's teeth on edge. She did not approach. His gate but stood beside a freshly hammered-in wooden stake with a bright pink ribbon tied to it, a stake that was a good 200 yards inside his property line. Art walked toward them, his work boots sinking into the soft earth. He didn't hurry. He stopped on his side of the wire fence, his presence a silent, immovable fact. "That's me," he said. His voice was gravelly, low. "Brenda Jorgensen," she announced, extending a hand over the fence as if expecting him to be honored. "I'm the president of the Evergreen Meadows HOA. This is Tom, our treasurer, and Mark, from our architectural review committee." Tom was a balding man who looked perpetually apologetic. Mark was young, smug, and holding an iPad like a shield. Art ignored her hand. "You're on my land, Brenda," he stated simply. Brenda's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Actually, that's what we're here to discuss. According to the official survey we just had commissioned, this stake marks the new boundary of the community's designated green space. Your fence will need to be moved." Art felt a cold, clean anger rise in him. It was the same feeling he'd gotten a lifetime ago when a MiG-29 had tried to lock onto his F-16 over a no-fly zone. Pure, undiluted clarity. "This fence has been here for 70 years, he said, his voice dropping even lower. "My father and I dug the post holes ourselves. It's not moving. You are." Mark, the iPad warrior, stepped forward. "Sir, with all due respect, your anecdotal history doesn't supersede a legally binding covenant and a certified survey. The documents are quite clear. This land was improperly zoned for decades. We're just correcting a historical oversight." "An oversight?" Art repeated the word, tasting its absurdity. "My family has paid taxes on this land, on every square inch of it, for over a century. You people show up 2 years ago, build a bunch of cardboard houses, and think you can just rewrite history with a binder full of rules? The rules are for the betterment of the entire community, Mr. Vance," Brenda said, her tone shifting from pleasant to patronizing. "A maintained green space will significantly increase property values for everyone. Your rustic aesthetic is frankly a bit of an eyesore. A beautiful community park would be a vast improvement over this overgrown field." Her eyes flicked past him, toward the barn, where the nose of his 1958 John Deere Model 720 tractor was visible. It was his workhorse, lovingly maintained but unapologetically old, its green paint faded and chipped, a fine layer of honest dust covering its engine. "This is a working farm," Art said, the words like granite. "It's supposed to look like one." "Not anymore," Brenda said, her smile returning, sharp and predatory. "At least this part isn't. We'll be sending a landscape architect by next week to draw up some preliminary plans. In the meantime, you'll need to remove any personal property from the premises. Effective immediately." The rage in Art's chest was a physical pressure. He thought of Sarah. He thought of what she would say. "Don't let them break the things you love, Artie." He looked at the three of them, Brenda, the queen bee, Tom, the drone, Mark, the princeling. They saw land as a commodity, a line item on a spreadsheet that determined their home's resale value. They couldn't comprehend what it meant to have a soul deep-rooted in the soil itself. They couldn't understand that they weren't just taking land. They were trying to amputate a piece of him. "Get off my property," he said, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. Brenda's face tightened. "This is community property now. Technically, you're the one trespassing." She turned to her companions. "We're done here. Let's go." As they walked back to their pristine SUV, she called over her shoulder, a final parting shot. "Oh, and Mr. Vance, the board has voted. You'll be receiving a formal violation notice. That unsightly piece of farm equipment will need to be removed from community land within 48 hours, or we'll have it towed." And believe me, the daily fines are quite steep. Art stood there long after the Lexus had purred away, leaving a cloud of dust that settled back onto the land it had come from. He looked at the pink-ribboned stake, a garish wound in the heart of his field. Unsightly piece of farm equipment. She was talking about his tractor, his father's tractor. He walked back to his workshop and sat on a wooden stool, the smell of oil and old wood a familiar comfort. He pulled out a worn leather photo album. He flipped through the pages, past black and white photos of his grandparents, past faded color snapshots of his own childhood. He stopped at a picture from 1965. A much younger version of his father stood proudly next to the John Deere, his arm around a 10-year-old Art. In the background, nestled inside the massive barn, was something else entirely, a North American P-51D Mustang, its silver fuselage gleaming, his grandfather's plane from the war. The North hayfield hadn't just been for hay. Its long, flat expanse had served another purpose. For his grandfather, and later for his father, a passionate, amateur pilot, it had been a landing strip. Vance Airfield, they'd called it. They'd stopped using it for planes 30 years ago, but the name and the memory remained. The HOA, in their infinite wisdom and lust for control, hadn't just claimed a field. They had, through a fluke of legal maneuvering and historical ignorance, declared a private airfield to be public property. A slow, cold smile spread across Art's face. It was a terrible, beautiful. The voice on the other end of the line was a ghost wrapped in satellite static, a voice Art hadn't heard in nearly a decade. It had more gravel than it used to, but the same unmistakable edge of command. Art? That you? I almost didn't recognize. The number. It's me, Mav, Art said, his grip tightening on the phone. How's the view from the Pentagon? A low chuckle. Boring. More meetings than flight hours. I'd trade a 4-star general for a functioning afterburner any day. What's wrong? You sound like you're about to declare war. Something like that, Art said, looking out the window at the single pink-ribboned stake. I'm calling in the marker, Mav. There was a pause. The light-hearted tone vanished from the other end, replaced by the dead-serious weight of a blood oath, the kind forged in fire and hydraulic fluid. Name it. I need a training exercise. Here. At my farm. Your farm? Confusion crept into the general's voice. Art, we run exercises in Nevada, not Kansas. What are you talking about? Vance Airfield, Art said, the words tasting of vindication. FAA registry is dormant, but it was never decommissioned. My grandfather's old strip. It's a mile long, flat as a carrier deck. I need you to reactivate it. I need low-altitude navigation drills, emergency landing simulations. I need you to make some noise. Another longer pause. Art could picture him. General Cole Maverick Mitchell, leaning forward in a leather chair in some soundproof Washington office, the gears of a formidable mind turning. Noise for who? A homeowners association. The silence that followed was so profound, Art thought the call had dropped. Then, a single sharp bark of laughter. An HOA? You're calling in a life debt to rattle a suburban cul-de-sac? This has to be the best story I've heard all year. They're trying to take my land, Mav. They've used some obscure covenant to rezone my north field, the airstrip, as community property. The laughter stopped. They're trying to take the field? That's not a zoning dispute, Art. That's theft. That's what I told them. They're sending landscape architects next week to plan a dog park. A dog park, Maverick repeated, the words dripping with disbelief. Okay, I see. You don't just want noise. You want to invoke federal preemption and active military training. Operation on a registered airfield makes any local ordinance, what's the word, moot. That's the idea, Art said. It's irregular. It'll take some creative paperwork. I'll have to pull some strings, call in some favors of my own. But For the man who dragged my burning F-16 out of enemy territory with nothing but a half-track and a bad attitude? Yeah, I think I can arrange a little readiness exercise. When do you need it? Yesterday, Art replied. Give me 48 hours to get the ball rolling. I'll have a survey team out there by Friday to check the specs on your airfield. Disguised as civilian contractors, of course. Keep your head down, Colonel, and send me the coordinates. The call ended. Art stood in the silent house, the weight of his decision settling over him. He had just pointed a cannon at a fly. But it was his fly, and it was sitting on his dinner plate. The next morning, the war began in earnest. A massive, greasy tow truck, its yellow emergency lights flashing with obscene cheerfulness, rumbled up his driveway. Behind it, in her white Lexus, was Brenda, a triumphant smirk plastered on her face. Art met them on the gravel path between the house and the barn. The tow truck driver, a large man with a weary expression, lumbered out of his cab holding a clipboard. Arthur Vance? The driver grunted. That's me, Art said, not taking his eyes off Brenda, who was now sashaying toward him, radiating smug satisfaction. Got a work order here from the Evergreen Meadows HOA, the driver said, avoiding eye contact, to remove one derelict tractor, a John Deere Model 720, from community property. First, Art said, his voice calm and dangerously level. You're standing on my private driveway, which is not community property. Second, that tractor is inside my barn, which is also not community property. And third, if you hook that vehicle to my father's tractor, I will personally see to it that you are charged with grand theft auto. That tractor is worth more than your truck and her car combined. The driver hesitated, looking from Art's stony face to Brenda's impatient one. Don't listen to him, Brenda chirped, waving a piece of paper. I have the violation notice right here, and the HOA bylaws are very clear. We have the authority to remove any non-compliant items from the common areas. This is not a common area, Art said, taking a deliberate step forward. He was shorter than the tow truck driver, but decades of military command gave him a presence that far exceeded his physical stature. This is the Vance farm. It has been for 110 years. Your little club's authority ends at my fence line. Now, I'm going to tell you one time, get your truck off my land. He's threatening us, Brenda said to the driver, her voice rising in pitch. You're a witness. The driver looked uneasy. He was just a guy trying to do a job. He'd towed cars from angry suburbanites before, but this was different. The old man in front of him didn't look angry. He looked like he could dismantle the truck with his bare hands if he felt so inclined. Look, lady, the driver said to Brenda, if it's in his barn, on his property, I can't touch it. The order says on community land. I see a field over there, with stakes in it. I don't see no tractor. Brenda's face contorted in frustration. It was there! He must have moved it to spite us! I moved it because I was going to work on it, Art said coolly. Something I do every winter, in my workshop, in my barn, on my property. Defeated for the moment, Brenda glared at him. This isn't over, Mr. Vance. The fines are already accumulating. Every single day that field goes unmowed, every day your rusty, non-compliant fence remains, you'll be charged. We'll lien your property. We'll bury you in legal fees. You'll wish you had just let us tow the damn tractor. She spun on her heel and marched back to her Lexus. The tow truck driver gave Art a sheepish shrug and climbed back into his cab, executing a clumsy three-point turn on the narrow drive before rumbling away. Art watched them go, the small victory, tasting like ash. She was right about one thing. They could bury him in fines and legal battles, a death by 1,000 paper cuts. He needed Maverick's plan to work. And he needed it to work fast. On Friday, as promised, a nondescript white van pulled up. Two men in crisp polo shirts and hard hats got out, carrying sophisticated-looking equipment. They weren't the friendly, talkative surveyors the HOA had used. These men were all business. They spoke little, moved with an unnerving efficiency, and ignored Art completely, which he knew was part of the protocol. He watched from his porch as they worked on the north hayfield. They weren't just marking boundaries. They used a ground-penetrating radar unit, took core samples of the soil, and measured the precise grade of the land. At one point, one of them used a laser transit to sight the tree lines, marking several high branches on a cluster of old oaks with small, nearly invisible tags. Brenda naturally could not resist. Her Lexus appeared within the hour. She marched onto the field, her binder of rules clutched to her chest like a holy text. Art watched, a grim smile touching his lips, as she tried to engage the surveyors. They showed her a laminated document on a clipboard. From this distance, Art couldn't read it, but he could guess its contents. It would be full of official-sounding jargon about geological surveys and environmental assessments, authorized by some obscure federal subcommittee. Brenda's posture changed as she read it. Her shoulders slumped. She gestured angrily, pointing back toward her pristine subdivision. The lead surveyor simply shook his head, said a few words, and turned back to his work, dismissing her as completely as one might shoo away a fly. Humiliated and furious, she retreated. The Queen had no authority here. For the next few days, a strange quiet fell. The official violation notices began to arrive in the mail, as promised. Each was a work of bureaucratic art: $100 fine unmaintained landscape, North Hayfield, $50 fine, non-approved fencing material, barbed wire, $200 fine, storage of inoperable derelict vehicle, John Deere 720. This one was particularly galling. $75 fine, unauthorized structural alterations. The survey stakes they themselves had put up, which were now being cited as his. Art didn't throw them away. He calmly filed each one in a folder labeled HOA nonsense. He spent his time preparing. He took a chainsaw to the branches the surveyors had tagged, clearing the flight path. He found the old windsock in the barn, its orange fabric tattered, but serviceable, and mounted it on a tall pole at the edge of the field. He was a man with a mission. Then, on the following Monday, the courier van arrived. Not USPS, not FedEx, but a government vehicle. The driver, in a crisp uniform, handed Art a thick, heavy envelope bearing the seal of the United States Department of Defense. Art signed for it and took it inside. He opened it. It was a multi-page document, dense with official language, but the key phrases jumped out at him. Activation of private airfield designation. Necessary for national security readiness. Operation Prairie Thunder. Joint training exercise. He smiled. The cannon was loaded. At that very moment, across the newly planted decorative maple trees and evergreen meadows, mail carriers were delivering the day's mail. But today, nearly every mailbox contained a matching envelope. Not from the Department of Defense, but from the Federal Aviation Administration. Brenda Jorgensen retrieved hers from her polished. The scream tore through the placid afternoon air of evergreen meadows. It was a sound so alien, so violent, that it defied all suburban context. It wasn't the sound of a commercial airliner on its descent to the city airport 30 miles away. This was a physical presence, a hostile entity ripping through the sky. On her pristine driveway, Brenda Jorgensen stood frozen, the FAA notice a flimsy, ridiculous piece of paper in her hand. Her mind refused to process the escalating roar. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong. Sounds like this didn't belong here, among the bird feeders and freshly mulched rose bushes. Inside his farmhouse, Art Vance stood by the window, a pair of old military-issue binoculars in his hand. He didn't need them to see, but the muscle memory was comforting. He felt the vibration first, a low thrumming in the floorboards that resonated deep in his bones. It was a feeling he hadn't felt in years, the imminent arrival of immense, controlled power. A slow, grim smile touched his lips. Right on time, Mav. The first A-10 Thunderbolt II burst over the western tree line. It wasn't sleek or elegant like the fighter's Art used to fly. It was a brute, a flying tank, painted in a mottled gray, camouflage that did little to hide its terrifying purpose. Its twin engines, mounted high on the fuselage, howled with a guttural fury. The plane was shockingly low, no more than 500 feet off the ground, its wingspan casting a fleeting cross-shaped shadow that swept across the identical beige houses of evergreen meadows. Car alarms shrieked to life in a panicked, chaotic chorus. A dog, a fluffy golden retriever enjoying a nap on a perfect lawn, yelped and bolted for its back door. A children's birthday party in a nearby backyard devolved into chaos as balloons scattered and a brightly colored bouncy castle sagged as if in fear. People poured out of their homes, shielding their eyes, mouths agape, pointing at the monstrous thing that had invaded their sky. Brenda stumbled backward, her hand flying to her throat. The sheer volume was a physical assault, pressing in on her, vibrating her teeth. The A-10 wasn't just passing over, it was descending, lining up with the north hayfield, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Its landing gear lowered with a hydraulic hiss that was somehow audible even over the engine roar. Then, just as its wheels seemed ready to kiss the long grass of the field, the pilot goosed the throttle. The engines erupted with a deafening, apocalyptic blast of sound. The plane aborted the landing, banking hard to the left, directly over Brenda's house. For a heart-stopping second, she could see the pilot in the cockpit, a helmeted, anonymous figure. The windows of her house rattled, violently in their frames. A decorative ceramic bird bath on her lawn vibrated off its pedestal and shattered on the flagstone path. Before the sound of the first jet had even begun to fade, its wingman appeared, following the same flight path, executing the same horrifyingly loud touch-and-go maneuver over the field. The two planes then circled, a pair of gray sharks in the clear Kansas sky, before climbing steeply and vanishing to the west, leaving behind a ringing, profound silence broken only by the cacophony of car alarms and a single crying baby. The silence lasted for 10 seconds. Then came the rage. It started as a murmur, a few bewildered homeowners stepping into the street talking to each other. Then voices rose, fueled by fear and indignation. Within 5 minutes, a mob was forming. Not a mob with pitchforks, but a modern suburban mob, armed with cell phones and a collective sense of entitlement. And at its head, her face, a mask of incandescent fury, was Brenda Jorgensen. She led them not to Art's front door, but to the fence line, the symbolic border of their conflict. The crowd swelled behind her, Tom the treasurer, Mark from the architectural committee, and 24 other residents, their faces flushed, their voices overlapping in a panicked babble. What in God's name was that? He's going to kill us all. My daughter is terrified. She won't come out from under her bed. Art was waiting for them. He had walked out onto his porch, holding the thick envelope from the Department of Defense. He wasn't smiling. His face was a mask of cold neutrality. "Vance!" Brenda shrieked, her voice hoarse. "What did you do? Are you insane?" "I'm conducting flight operations on my airfield," Art said calmly, his voice carrying easily over the din. "Something my family has done on this land for over 80 years. That was a military jet, a warplane." Mark, the iPad warrior, yelled, his usual smugness replaced by a pale, trembling fear. "You can't just land warplanes in a residential neighborhood." "First," Art said, raising his voice just enough to cut through the noise, "it didn't land. That was a practice approach. Second, this is not a residential neighborhood. This is a federally registered private airfield with an adjacent agricultural zone. You live in the residential neighborhood." He patted the thick wooden post of his porch. "I live at the airport. This is illegal," a man in a golf shirt shouted. "You're endangering our children." "On the contrary," Art said, holding up the DOD envelope. "Everything I am doing is perfectly legal and sanctioned by the United States government for national security purposes. It's called Operation Prairie Thunder." He let the official name hang in the air, its ominous weight settling over the crowd. "You all should have received a notification from the FAA this morning explaining the situation." Brenda's face went white. The letter she had dismissed as nonsense was now being quoted back at her as fact. She had been outmaneuvered in a way she couldn't possibly have imagined. Her bylaws, her covenants, her fines, they were all meaningless. "Children's toys in the face of this! I'm calling the police!" she finally sputtered, fumbling for her phone. "We'll see how legal this is when the sheriff gets here." "Good," Art said, nodding slowly. "I'd like to speak with him." 20 minutes later, a county sheriff's cruiser pulled up, lights flashing. Sheriff Brody was a big man with a weary face who'd known the Vance family his whole life. He got out of his car and surveyed the scene. The angry, well-dressed crowd on one side of the fence and the solitary figure of Art Vance on the other. He sighed. It was going to be one of those days. He listened patiently to Brenda's hysterical, rapid-fire account, punctuated by corroborations from the other homeowners. She spoke of endangerment, noise violations, reckless disregard for public safety. She demanded Art be arrested. When she was finally done, Brody turned and walked over to the fence, stopping a respectful distance from Art's porch. "Art," he said, his voice low, "you want to tell me what in the Sam Hill is going on?" My dispatch board lit up like a Christmas tree. "People from 5 miles away are calling about a low-flying jet." Art walked down from the porch and handed the sheriff the entire packet from the Department of Defense. Brody took it, his eyebrows knitting together as he read. He scanned the authorization codes, the official letterhead, the FAA flight plan, designation. He read the section on federal preemption over local ordinances. He looked up, then back at the pages, then at the sky, as if expecting another jet to appear. He walked back over to Brenda, the crowd parting before him. He handed the papers back to Art. "Folks," Sheriff Brody said, his voice carrying the weary authority of a man who had seen it all. "I understand you're upset, but as far as I can tell, Mr. Vance isn't breaking any laws." A collective gasp went through the crowd. "What are you talking about?" Brenda demanded. "He flew a military jet over our houses." "According to this," Brody said, gesturing toward Art, "this property contains a registered airfield currently being used for a sanctioned Department of Defense training exercise. That gives them jurisdiction, federal jurisdiction. My authority, and frankly the authority of the Evergreen Meadows HOA, ends where that federal authority begins. There's nothing I can do." "So that's it?" a woman cried out. "He can just terrorize us, and we have no recourse?" "Your recourse, ma'am," Brody said, his patience wearing thin, "is with your federal government, not the county sheriff. My advice is to stay inside when you hear them coming." He gave the crowd a final, dismissive look, tipped his hat to Art, and walked back to his cruiser. The crowd stood in stunned, impotent silence as the sheriff drove away. They had brought their best weapon, the assumption that authority and the law were on their side, and it had been useless. They had been utterly, comprehensively defeated. One by one they began to drift away, muttering amongst themselves, their righteous anger deflating into confused despair. Finally, only Brenda was left standing at the fence, her face a thunderous mask of humiliation. She stared at Art, her eyes promising a war that had only just begun. "You think you've won, you old bastard," she hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper. "You think this is over? You just made this personal. You have no idea what you've started." She turned and stalked back toward her house. Art watched her go, feeling no triumph, only a deep, gnawing exhaustion. He had won the battle, but she was right. The war was far from over. He was about to turn and go inside when another vehicle appeared, a white van with a large Channel 8 News logo on the side. It pulled to a stop, and a reporter with a microphone and a cameraman jumped out. They had clearly picked up the chatter on the police scanner, and they went directly to Brenda. Art watched from his porch as she visibly transformed. The rage vanished, replaced by a mask of profound concern and maternal fear. She pointed to her shattered birdbath. She gestured toward the sky. Her voice. The Channel 8 news segment aired at 6 o'clock. It was a masterpiece of manipulative storytelling. The piece opened with shaky, handheld footage of the A-10 screaming over the subdivision, followed by a tight shot of a terrified child hiding behind her mother's legs. Brenda, her face a mask of Emmy-worthy concern, was cast as the heroic community advocate, the voice of reason against a tide of airborne terror. Art watched from the worn armchair in his living room. They showed his farmhouse in long, ominous shots, filmed through a telephoto lens that made it look dark and menacing. They never showed his face, only his silhouette on the porch, painting him as a faceless, shadowy antagonist. The reporter used words like vendetta, escalation, and reign of terror. They interviewed half a dozen Evergreen Meadows residents who spoke of rattling windows, sleepless nights, and the psychological trauma inflicted upon their children by the shock and awe campaign next door. Not once did they mention the HOA's initial letter, the attempted seizure of his land, or the towing attempt. By morning, the local story had become a national one. It was the perfect, easily digestible controversy for the 24-hour news cycle. A bizarre conflict between suburban bliss and military might. A cable news network ran a segment with the chyron, Flightmare in Kansas, veteran wages jet-fueled war on his neighbors. Online, Art Jets vs HOA was trending. Art's phone began to ring. He didn't answer. His email inbox, an account he used, mostly for ordering parts and keeping up with old Air Force buddies, was flooded with messages from strangers. They called him a monster, a terrorist, a bitter old man who got his kicks frightening children. The real-world siege began the next day. Brenda, emboldened by her newfound fame, had organized a protest. A dozen residents stood outside his main gate holding professionally printed signs. "Our children deserve peace. Clip your grass, not our wings. Honk if you hate jet noise." A steady stream of cars, mostly from Evergreen Meadows, dutifully honked as they drove by. News vans were now a permanent fixture at the end of his road. Art felt like a prisoner in his own home. He was a man accustomed to the vast, open solitude of the sky, and now he was caged, watched from all sides. The anger he had felt was beginning to curdle into a weary bitterness. This was a battle of attrition, a fight he wasn't sure how to win. The jets still came. Twice a day, like clockwork, a pair of A-10s would appear on the horizon. They ran their drills with professional detachment, their thunderous passes a reminder of the power Art still held. But each time they did, the protesters would shriek and duck for the cameras, and Brenda would give another impassioned interview about her community's daily trauma. She was weaponizing his own strategy against him. The call from Maverick came on Thursday evening. "Art, I'm looking at a live feed of your farm on a national news network right now," the general said, his voice strained. "There are people with picket signs. What the hell is going on?" "It's a long story, Mav. Well, you better shorten it for me because I've got a 2-star general from Public Affairs breathing down my neck, and he's getting calls from Congressman Davies' office. That's your congressman, by the way. He's talking about launching a formal inquiry." Art's stomach tightened. This was the political blowback Maverick had warned him about. "Brenda, the HOA president, she's smart. She's turned this into a media circus. They're painting me as the bad guy." "They're doing a damn good job of it," Maverick grunted. "Look, Art, I can hold them off for a little while. Operation Prairie Thunder is officially a go, and shutting it down now because a few suburbanites are complaining would be a logistical and political nightmare. But I can't protect you forever. If this congressman decides to make it a crusade, my hands will be tied. The optics on this are terrible. You need to get control of the narrative, and you need to do it fast." The line went dead. Art sat in the silence, the weight of the world pressing down on him. He was a pilot, a strategist. He was trained to analyze a threat, identify its weaknesses, and strike with precision. He had been treating Brenda and her HOA as the threat, but he was wrong. The threat wasn't Brenda. It was the story she was telling. He couldn't win by telling his own story to the same cameras. They weren't interested in the truth. They were interested in the conflict. He needed someone who could see the entire battlefield, who understood, not just the story, but the mechanics of how stories are told and, more importantly, how they are dismantled. He powered up his old desktop computer. He didn't go to social media. He went to a secure alumni network for Air Force veterans. He typed in a name, and after a moment, a profile appeared. Sarah Jenkins, former Air Force intelligence officer. Served 2 tours in Afghanistan analyzing enemy propaganda and information warfare. She'd left the service 5 years ago and was now an independent investigative journalist running a small but highly respected online publication called The Objective. Her tagline was simple: "We don't cover the story, we uncover the facts." Art stared at her picture. She had sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through the screen. He composed a short, cryptic email. Subject: Operation Prairie. Thunderams. Jenkins, I believe the story being told about the events in Grafton County, Kansas, is a textbook example of tactical misinformation. You analyze propaganda. I'm currently the target of it. I have the facts, if you're interested in them. Collector Arthur Vance, USAF, Retor. He hit send, not knowing if he'd even get a reply. 2 days later, a dusty Subaru Outback that looked as out of place as a UFO drove past the news vans and the protesters and pulled right up to his gate. A woman in her late 30s, with her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, got out. She wasn't carrying a microphone or a camera, just a notepad and a pen. She met his gaze from 100 yards away and gave a slight, respectful nod. Art walked out and met her at the fence. "Colonel Vance," she said, her voice crisp. "Sarah Jenkins. Your email was intriguing." "Thanks for coming," Art said. "It's a bit of a circus." "I've covered war zones, Colonel," she said, her eyes scanning the protesters, the news vans, and the manicured houses beyond. "This is just a different kind of combat." He spent the next 3 hours with her. He didn't give her a sob story. He gave her data. He laid it all out on his dining room table, the original deed to the farm, signed in 1912. The FAA registration for Vance Airfield from 1946. His grandfather's, his father's, and his own military service records. He showed her the framed photos of the P-51 Mustang in the barn, his father standing on the wing. He gave her the pile of HOA violation notices, the cream-colored letter declaring his land community property, and the threatening correspondence. He laid out the facts, point by point in chronological order, just as he would in a mission debrief. She listened intently, taking meticulous notes, asking sharp, insightful questions. She didn't ask how he felt. She asked when the first survey stake was placed, what the specific wording of the covenant was, and what the county's tax assessment records showed for the property line. When he was done, she stood up. "Thank you, Colonel," she said. "This is more than enough. I have what I need." She left as quietly as she arrived. Art had no idea what she planned to do or if it would make any difference. The next afternoon, the climax of Brenda's campaign arrived. A black sedan with government plates pulled up, and Congressman Davies emerged, his suit immaculate, his hair perfect. Brenda greeted him with a handshake for the cameras. He was a young, ambitious politician who knew a golden media opportunity when he saw one. He stood at a podium that had been set up on the street, the Evergreen Meadows sign as his backdrop. Brenda and a few other carefully selected concerned mothers stood behind him. The news cameras were rolling. "I am here today," Davies began, his voice ringing with synthetic sincerity, to stand with the good people of Evergreen Meadows, to stand against this outrageous campaign of intimidation and fear. It is unacceptable that families in my district should be subjected to the noise and danger of military-grade aircraft because of one man's personal dispute. I am calling for an immediate congressional investigation, and I will not rest until these flights have stopped and this community can feel safe again." It was a powerful performance. The crowd of protesters cheered. Brenda looked on, a beatific, triumphant smile on her face. This was it, the checkmate. Just as the applause began to die down, a voice cut through the air. "Congressman Davies!" The crowd turned. Sarah Jenkins stood there, her notepad in hand. She had slipped in unnoticed amongst the other media. Sarah Jenkins. "The objective," she said calmly. "You mentioned this was a personal dispute. Are you aware that the land the HOA attempted to appropriate under Covenant 17 is a federally registered airfield that has been in the Vance family for 3 generations and served as a training ground for decorated pilots in World War II and the Korean War?" The congressman blinked, caught off guard. "Well, the issue here is safety." Sarah didn't let him finish. She turned her attention to Brenda, her voice remaining level, but with a new, sharp edge. "Ms. Jorgensen, your HOA's initial violation notice cited Mr. Vance for storing unsightly agricultural equipment on that land. Were you aware that the man you are publicly accusing of terrorism is a retired Air Force colonel, a recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross, for actions taken in defense of this country?" The question landed like a... The moment Sarah Jenkins asked her questions, the air crackled with the palpable shift of a narrative collapsing. The reporters, who had been lazily documenting a simple human interest story, suddenly smelled blood in the water. They turned like a pack, their microphones and cameras swiveling from the politician's podium to the now flustered HOA president. "Ms. Jorgensen, is it true your initial action against Colonel Vance was an attempt to seize 50 acres of his family's land? Congressman, does your office typically get involved in zoning disputes without reviewing the full history of the properties involved?" "Brenda, did you know he was a decorated veteran when you tried to have his father's tractor towed?" Congressman Davies, a man whose career was built on avoiding substantive answers, saw the political cliff edge rushing up to meet him. He raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Clearly, there are new facts that have come to light," he stammered, his practiced sincerity cracking. "My office will be conducting a full and thorough review. We support all our veterans and..." He was drowned out by the renewed clamor. He made a hasty retreat to his sedan, offering a weak wave before disappearing inside, leaving Brenda to face the fire alone. She was not equipped for this kind of battle. Her power was derived from the minutiae of bylaws and the unassailable confidence of a bully on her home turf. Exposed in the national spotlight, stripped of her victim status, she crumbled. This has all been taken out of context," she insisted, her voice shrill. "The issue has always been about the safety of our... But the word children, once her unassailable shield, now sounded hollow and manipulative. She saw the looks on the faces of the reporters. She saw the doubt beginning to creep into the eyes of her own protesting neighbors. She had lost. In the space of 30 seconds, her entire crusade had been revealed for what it was: a petty, ignorant power grab. The next morning, Sarah Jenkins's article was published on The Objective. It wasn't just an article, it was an ordinance package. The headline was simple and devastating: "The Homestead and the HOA, How a Kansas Community Tried to Erase a Century of American Military History." It laid out the facts with the cold, irrefutable precision of an intelligence briefing. It featured a high-resolution scan of the 1912 deed, the 1946 FAA registration for Vance Airfield, and the official letter declaring the field community property. It placed the violation notice for the unsightly John Deere tractor next to a black and white photo of a young Lieutenant Vance standing proudly beside that same tractor with his father, home on leave from the Korean War. The article was a viral firestorm. It was shared by veterans groups, aviation enthusiasts, historical societies, and legions of people who were simply fed up with overbearing HOAs. The narrative didn't just flip, it was annihilated. The comment sections were a brutal digital consensus. Brenda Jorgensen wasn't a concerned mother, she was a villain. The Evergreen Meadows HOA wasn't a victim. It was a national laughingstock. For Art, the change was immediate. The hate mail in his inbox was replaced by a flood of supportive messages from strangers around the country. A retired Marine Corps general offered his legal assistance free of charge. A historical preservation society offered to help get Vance Airfield designated as a landmark. For Evergreen Meadows, the fallout was catastrophic. The protest signs vanished overnight. The news vans, now chasing a different story, turned their cameras on the HOA itself. Tom, the treasurer, and Mark from the architectural committee resigned from the board via a terse public email, stating they had been operating on incomplete information provided by the president. The final reckoning came at an emergency HOA meeting held in the community clubhouse that Sunday. The room was packed, the mood ugly. Brenda stood at the front, no longer a triumphant leader but a defendant in the dock. The residents she had led were now the jury and the executioner. They weren't angry about the Jets anymore. They were angry about their plunging property values and the public humiliation. An older man, a quiet resident, Art had only ever seen, tending his garden, stood up holding a printout of Sarah's article. "I have a question, Brenda," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "Did you really think you could steal land from a war hero and get away with it? You've made us all look like fools and bullies." "Now let's not be hasty," Brenda began, falling back on her procedural tone. "There are bylaws that—" "The bylaws?" a woman shouted from the back. "You mean the same bylaws you ignored when you had your own fence installed 2 inches over the property line last year?" Another resident stood up. "And what about your unapproved satellite dish, Brenda? That's a clear violation of Article before, Section 8. I believe that carries a $200 fine." It was a mutiny. They were using her own rule book, her own meticulously crafted weapons of petty tyranny against her. She was deluged by a flood of grievances, a dozen minor infractions she had committed herself while holding the rest of the community to an impossible standard. The vote for her removal as president was unanimous. She left the clubhouse to a chorus of boos, her reign of terror over. The next morning, Art was cleaning a spark plug in his workshop when Sheriff Brody's cruiser crunched up the gravel driveway. The sheriff got out, not with a summons, but with a box of donuts. "Figured you might be owed an apology, Art," Brody said, handing him the box. "On behalf of the whole damn county. Things got a little out of hand." "You were just doing your job, Bill," Art said, taking the box. "Maybe," Brody said with a shrug. "Still, a man's home is his home. His land is his land. Some things ought to be simple." He looked over at the north hayfield, now quiet. "So, the air show over for good?" As if on cue, Art's phone buzzed. It was Maverick. "Good news. Colonel," the general's voice boomed. "Your congressman called the Secretary of Defense's office personally, apologized for the misunderstanding, and said he fully supports Operation Prairie Thunder as a vital component of national readiness. You're clear. In fact, they love the story now. It's a PR win, the Air Force supporting a veteran's legacy." "Glad to be of service," Art said dryly. "We're wrapping up the exercise tomorrow," Maverick continued. "Thought we'd do one final pass, a little ceremonial flight. Look to the west around noon." The next day, Art stood on his porch. The air was calm. The news vans were gone. The only sound was the wind rustling through the leaves of the old oak tree. At precisely 1200 hours, he heard a familiar sound. Not the guttural howl of the A-10s, but the throaty, iconic roar of a Merlin engine. A P-51D Mustang, gleaming silver in the midday sun, flew low and steady over the field. It was the same type of plane his grandfather had flown, a beautiful living piece of history. As it reached the end of the field, it banked gracefully. And from behind it, an A-10 Thunderbolt II appeared, flying slowly, its wings shadowing the smaller plane. The modern war machine and the vintage warbird flew in perfect formation, a heritage flight that bridged the generations. They dipped their wings in a final, respectful salute to Vance Airfield, to the man standing on the porch, and to the legacy he had refused to let die. Sarah Jenkins, who had driven out to say goodbye, stood beside him, watching the planes disappear into the blue expanse. "You know," she said quietly, "Brenda Jorgensen is selling her house. The new HOA board sent her 3 violation notices in 1 week. The final one was for unmaintained emotional landscape." Art didn't laugh. He just nodded, a small, sad smile on his face. He looked at the field, the barn, and the old John Deere tractor parked beside it, a silent, steadfast sentinel. The land was quiet, the sky was clear, and it was all his. The battle was over. Peace, hard-won and absolute, had finally returned to the Vance farm.